The mountain did not announce what it had taken. When the searchers finally reached the slope in late February, weeks after the hikers had vanished, they expected the familiar signs of a winter tragedy: a collapsed tent, a body buried in snow, evidence of exhaustion or miscalculation. What they found instead felt wrong from the very first glance. The tent was still standing. It leaned awkwardly against the wind, half buried in drifted snow, its silhouette sharp against the white emptiness. At first, that alone seemed strange. The storms in this region were brutal. A tent left unattended for weeks should have been flattened or scattered. But this one remained, wounded rather than destroyed. As the rescuers moved closer, the details grew disturbing. The canvas was torn open, not at the entrance, not where the zipper was located, but slashed across the side in long, desperate cuts. The fabric had been sliced from the inside. Snow had poured through the openings, covering blankets, boots, coats, and backpacks. Everything the hikers would have needed to survive the night lay abandoned within arm's reach. Seasoned mountaineers stopped and stared. No one leaves a tent like this in winter, not trained hikers, not in temperatures that could kill within minutes. Footprints led away from the campsite. They descended the slope in a loose line, heading toward the dark forest below. The tracks were eerily clear, pressed into the hardened snow as if time itself had paused to preserve them. But what the footprints showed unsettled the searchers even more than the torn tent. Some were barefoot, others wore only socks. One set showed a single shoe. There were no signs of running, no chaotic scuffling. The prints suggested walking measured, deliberate steps taken by people who should have known better, people who understood exactly what the cold would do to exposed skin. The trail stretched downhill for nearly a mile before disappearing into deeper snow. At the forest's edge, the first bodies were found. Two young men lay beneath a towering cedar tree, dressed only in underwear. Their skin was darkened by frost. Their hands were raw, scraped bloody, as if they had clawed at the bark in a final futile attempt to climb. Nearby, the remains of a small campfire sat frozen in the snow, a weak ember of resistance against an indifferent night. It only got worse from there. Between the forest and the tent, 3 more bodies appeared, spaced apart as though each had collapsed alone. One lay face down, arms positioned as if crawling. Another was found farther uphill, fists clenched. The third rested on his back, staring sightlessly at the sky. They looked like people trying to go home and failing. The injuries told no clear story. Some showed signs of hypothermia, others had fractured bones. But there were no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds, no tracks from animals or attackers. Nothing that explained why 9 capable hikers had fled their shelter and died, scattered across a frozen mountainside. And still, 4 were missing. As days passed, unease spread through the search teams. Veterans of accidents and disasters admitted they had never seen anything like this. Every discovery contradicted what experience said should be true. Every answer raised new questions. The mountain remained silent. Weeks later, when the snow finally began to melt, the last 4 bodies would be found, and whatever certainty the searchers still clung to would vanish with them. Because what waited beneath the thawed snow would ensure that this was not just a tragedy, it was a mystery that refused to behave like one. To understand why what happened on that mountain was so unsettling, you first have to understand who those hikers were. They were not thrill-seekers chasing danger for its own sake. They were not careless students pretending at heroism. Each member of the group had earned their place through discipline, endurance, and experience, forged in the unforgiving Russian winter. At the center of the expedition stood Igor Dyatlov. At just 23 years old, Dyatlov had already built a reputation among his peers as calm, methodical, and relentlessly prepared. He planned routes meticulously, checked equipment obsessively, and believed that survival in the wilderness came not from bravado, but from respect for nature's rules. Those who followed him trusted him not because he was charismatic, but because he was precise. Around him was a team equally capable. Zenaida Kolmogorova was known for her resilience and optimism, often pushing morale forward when conditions grew grim. Rustem Slobodin was disciplined and quiet, a man who endured hardship without complaint. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishchenko were strong and physically tough, used to labor and cold. Lyudmila Dubinina was determined and outspoken, refusing to turn back even when injured. Alexander Kolovatov was thoughtful and technically skilled. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol came from a privileged background but never expected special treatment. Semyon Zolotaryov, the oldest of the group, was a decorated war veteran who had survived battles most people could not imagine. And then there was Yuri Yudin. Yudin had trained alongside them. He laughed with them, planned with them, and boarded the train north with the same confidence. He was one of them until his body betrayed him. Severe joint pain forced him to turn back early in the journey. At the time, it felt like a temporary disappointment. In reality, it was the moment fate drew a line. Every member of the group had completed difficult expeditions before. Some had endured blizzards. Others had survived injuries far from help. They understood cold, exhaustion, and risk. Friends and instructors later said these were people who thrived where others panicked. The Russian winter wasn't an enemy to them, it was a proving ground. This is what makes the mystery so enduring. People who panic leave signs behind. They make mistakes that feel human and familiar. These hikers did not behave that way, at least not at first. In the days leading up to the disaster, their diaries told a story of confidence and routine. They joked about frozen boots and poor weather. They teased one another. They recorded distances traveled, meals cooked, and minor frustrations that felt ordinary, even dull. There was no sense of dread. They spoke of the cold the way sailors speak of waves, dangerous, yes, but expected. The expedition was hard, but not beyond them. Nothing in their writing suggested fear, conflict, or desperation. That normalcy is what cuts deepest. Because when trained, disciplined people do something irrational, it implies something powerful forced their hand. This wasn't a group on the edge of collapse. It wasn't a team unraveling under pressure. By all accounts, morale remained high. The jokes continued. The photographs show smiles strained by cold, not terror, which raises a chilling question. If these were capable, confident hikers, people who understood exactly what stepping into the night without boots would mean, what could have driven them to do it anyway? Why would a war veteran and seasoned mountaineers abandon shelter together? Why would no one stop the others? Why would all 9 make the same fatal decision? The answers don't lie in weakness or ignorance. They lie somewhere else, something external, sudden, and overwhelming enough to override experience itself. And the last days before the mountain claimed them would make that painfully clear. The journey north unfolded without drama. After leaving the last settlement behind, the hikers moved deeper into the uninhabited spine of the mountains, skiing through forests heavy with snow and across frozen rivers that creaked beneath their weight. The landscape was vast and empty, broken only by wind and the rhythmic scrape of skis. In their diaries, the days blended together, distances logged, weather noted, meals described with dry humor. Someone complained about frozen fingers, someone else joked about poor singing. They argued playfully about navigation and teased one another for small mistakes. It was the language of people fully engaged in the present, focused on routine rather than danger. Photographs from this stretch of the trek show bundled figures grinning through scarves, eyes squinting against wind and glare. Faces were tired but relaxed. There was no sense of urgency, no sign of anxiety. If anything, they appeared comfortable professionals moving through a hostile environment they understood. The cold intensified as they climbed. Temperatures dropped well below zero. Winds cut across open ridges without mercy. At night, they huddled in the tent, cooking hot meals, drying socks, and writing by dim light. Outside, the mountains waited in silence. On January 31st, the group reached a river valley at the edge of the high slopes. There, they made a practical decision. They cached extra supplies, food, and equipment they wouldn't need for the ascent, planning to retrieve them on the return journey. It was the kind of choice experienced hikers made automatically, a sign that they expected to come back. Nothing in their notes suggested otherwise. The next morning brought worsening conditions. Visibility dropped as clouds rolled in, flattening the world into shades of white and gray. Navigation became harder. Landmarks vanished. The group drifted slightly off their intended route, pushed sideways by wind and terrain. This wasn't unusual. Winter travel in the mountains often meant accepting imperfect progress. Turning back every time conditions deteriorated would mean never going anywhere at all. The decision-making now fell to Igor Dyatlov. He chose to continue upward. Rather than retreating to the forest below for shelter, he opted to camp high on the slope. It was an exposed position, but not unheard of. Camping higher meant maintaining altitude and avoiding backtracking the next day. It also offered a chance to practice skills required for their highest certification. The slope itself wasn't steep enough to feel threatening. The snow was deep but seemingly stable. To create a level surface, they cut into the hillside, carving a platform just wide enough for their tent. It was a calculated risk. Inside, the mood remained steady. They ate, joked, and documented the day. One diary entry poked fun at the weather. Another referenced the cold with casual resignation. Someone took photographs despite numb fingers. There was no hint that this night would be different. No warning recorded. No argument noted. No expression of doubt. When darkness fell, the wind strengthened, pressing against the canvas. Snow drifted against the tent walls. The mountain groaned softly, the way frozen landscapes do when temperature and pressure shift. Inside the tent, 9 people lay down to sleep. They were exhausted, but calm. confident enough to close their eyes, certain enough of morning to plan for it. Whatever happened next did not give them time to write it down. There would be no diary entry explaining the fear, no photograph capturing the moment of realization, no words left behind to describe what made experienced hikers abandon shelter and walk into death, only actions, and those actions would be so strange, so profoundly out of character, that they would haunt every attempt to explain them, because sometime after midnight, something changed, something broke the logic of experience. And the mountain, which had been silent all along, finally made its move. No one knows the exact moment it began. There was no alarm, no shouted warning preserved in ink or memory. The night erased those details. What remains is a sequence of actions so abrupt and irreversible that they suggest a single truth. Whatever happened gave them no time to think it through. Sometime after midnight, the calm inside the tent shattered. Something forced the group awake. Not gradually, not with the slow irritation of wind or cold. This was sudden enough, urgent enough that none of them reached for boots or coats. None of them gathered supplies. None of them even used the tent's entrance. They cut their way out. Knives sliced through canvas in long, slashing motions, tearing open the side of the tent. Snow poured in immediately, burying blankets and gear. In seconds, the space that had sheltered them became uninhabitable. The choice to cut instead of unzip matters. It means whatever threatened them made the entrance inaccessible or irrelevant. It means they believed seconds mattered. It means 9 people independently accepted the same risk. Stepping into 30-batic temperatures half-dressed was preferable to staying where they were. They emerged into darkness and wind. The slope offered no protection. Snow whipped sideways. Visibility was poor. The forest below was the only landmark, dark, distant, and lower. Lower meant shelter. Trees meant wood. Trees meant survival. They moved together at first. The footprints show a loose formation heading downhill, not a panic sprint, but a purposeful retreat. Some were barefoot. Some wore socks. One wore a single shoe. The snow was hard enough to preserve their steps, and those steps tell a story that still confounds experts. They were walking, not running, not scattering. Walking as a group, as if following an unspoken plan. As if panic was being held at bay by discipline, by training drilled deep enough to function even when fear took over. Whatever had driven them out did not immediately pursue them. At the edge of the forest, they stopped. Here, the group fractured not in conflict, but in function. 2 men, the strongest, worked to start a fire beneath a cedar tree. Bark was torn away by bare hands. Branches snapped high above the ground, suggesting desperate climbing for dry wood. The fire they managed was small, fragile, but real. It was hope. Others moved away from the fire. 3 of them turned back toward the slope, toward the tent they had fled. Whether they believed the danger had passed or felt compelled to recover supplies, no one can say. The cold decided for them. One collapsed first. Another made it farther before falling. The third nearly reached the point where the slope began to rise, but not quite. Their bodies formed a silent line pointing back toward shelter, as if marking the path they could not finish. At the fire, the situation worsened. Without proper clothing, the 2 men beneath the cedar tree lasted minutes, not hours. Hypothermia works quickly when the body is exposed, faster when exhaustion is already present. Their hands, stripped of skin and bloodied, showed how hard they fought to stay alive. Some of the others tried to adapt. Clothing was taken from the dead not out of cruelty but necessity. Layers were redistributed. Decisions were made in whispers or gestures, fingers numb, breath visible in the dark. 4 of them moved deeper into the forest. They sought terrain that could shield them from wind, perhaps a hollow where snow could be carved into protection. They found a ravine, its sides steep and its floor choked with snow. There they dug into the bank, creating a shallow den. It was the right instinct. It was also their last. Sometime later, the snow above them gave way. Not a roaring wall of white, not the cinematic destruction people imagine, but a sudden, crushing collapse. Dense, compacted snow pressed down with immense force, pinning bodies against rock and earth, ribs fractured, skulls cracked. Lungs failed under pressure. There were no screams left to hear. When the mountain finished moving, it left no obvious trace. Wind smoothed the slope. Snow filled the ravine. Silence returned, complete and indifferent. By morning, there were no survivors, only a tent torn open in the night. Only footprints leading away from safety. Only a question that would echo for decades. What could make experienced hikers choose the cold over shelter? And why did none of them ever make it back? The mountain did not reveal everything at once. After the first bodies were found, the search slowed not because of uncertainty, but because of dread. Each new discovery seemed to violate a different rule of logic. Together, they formed a picture no one could reconcile. The two men beneath the cedar tree were the first confirmation that something had gone terribly wrong. They were nearly naked, their skin darkened and stiff with cold. The fire beside them had burned briefly, then failed. It told a simple story. They had reached the forest alive, had tried to survive, and had lost. But even here, questions emerged. Their hands were shredded, skin torn away, fingers raw and bloody. The bark high on the cedar was damaged, branches snapped well above head height. They hadn't just gathered firewood. They had climbed desperately, violently using bare hands in freezing temperatures. Why? What were they trying to reach? As the search continued uphill, the answers became less clear. 3 bodies lay scattered between the forest and the tent, spaced apart as if time itself had stretched their final moments. One was face down, arms frozen in a crawling posture. Another lay farther up, fists clenched tight. The third rested on his back, eyes open, as though staring into the blank sky. They looked like people who had made a decision and paid for it slowly. The medical examinations brought little comfort. Hypothermia explained some deaths, but not all. One skull showed a fracture, but investigators initially attributed it to a fall. At the time, it seemed plausible. Then the snow began to melt. In early May, when the ravine deep in the forest finally revealed its secret, the last 4 hikers were found. They were buried beneath meters of compacted snow, packed so tightly it had preserved them in place. And what the searchers saw changed the nature of the mystery forever. These 4 were dressed more warmly than the others. They wore multiple layers, some of which had clearly belonged to their dead companions. This alone suggested planning, adaptation, and time, evidence that at least some of the group had survived long enough to think, to make choices. But their injuries were catastrophic. One man's skull was fractured with immense force. Another's chest was crushed inward, ribs broken on both sides. A woman's ribcage had collapsed so completely that doctors compared the damage to injuries sustained in high-speed car accidents. Yet there were almost no external wounds, no bruises, no cuts, no signs of a beating or a fall from height. The skin was largely intact, as if the force had come from everywhere at once. Then came the detail that would dominate headlines for decades. One of the women was missing her tongue. Her eyes were gone. Parts of her lips and facial tissue had vanished as well. For grieving families, this was unbearable. For investigators, it was inexplicable. Officially, the damage was attributed to decomposition and scavenging animals, accelerated by water flowing through the ravine after the snow began to melt. But official explanations did little to calm suspicion. As reports circulated, more anomalies surfaced. Some bodies had burns on their hands and legs. Others showed strange discoloration and orange-brown hue that relatives insisted had not been present in life. And then there was the radiation. Traces of radioactive material were detected on the clothing of 2 hikers. In the frozen wilderness of the Ural Mountains, this detail landed like a thunderclap. Radiation didn't belong here. It didn't belong anywhere near a student hiking expedition. The medical examiner admitted uncertainty. He could list causes of death, but not causes of behavior. He could document injuries, but not explain how they were inflicted. No single theory tied everything together. Why did some die of exposure while others were crushed? Why did the group split the way it did? Why leave the tent at all? And perhaps most disturbing of all, why did none of the evidence suggest chaos? There was fear, yes, desperation, injury, but no signs of a violent struggle. No evidence of another group. No tracks besides their own. 9 people had acted together, then fallen apart in ways that made no sense. As word of the findings spread, the Soviet public reacted with shock. Families demanded answers. Rumors grew louder. Officials grew quieter. By late spring, the case was closed. The hikers, the report stated, had died due to a compelling natural force. No further explanation was offered. The files were archived. Access was restricted. Conversations were discouraged, but the questions refused to stay buried, and in the absence of answers, imagination rushed in to fill the void. When the official investigation ended, the story did not. It fractured. In the silence left behind by vague conclusions and sealed files, speculation began to grow. At first, it was cautious questions whispered in kitchens, doubts shared quietly among families. But as years passed, those whispers hardened into theories, each one trying to impose meaning on a case that seemed to resist it. The most persistent rumors came from the sky. Residents in nearby settlements reported seeing glowing orbs drifting across the night during the same period the hikers disappeared. Orange lights, red spheres, slow-moving and silent. Not flares, not meteors, not aircraft, be it. When some of the hikers' photographs were developed, a few frames showed blurred streaks of light against darkness. For many, this was proof enough. If the hikers had seen something they weren't supposed to see, everything else followed. The Soviet Union was no stranger to secrecy. Remote regions were used for military testing. Parachute mines explosives designed to detonate midair could cause massive internal injuries without leaving obvious external wounds. The crushed ribs and fractured skulls suddenly seemed less mysterious. Burns, radiation, sealed files, it all fit a narrative people already believed. Too well. Others looked to the ground instead of the sky. Some suggested the hikers had stumbled onto a classified military operation and were silenced. Others imagined escaped prisoners, foreign spies, or violent confrontations that had been carefully erased from the record. The fact that the tent was cut from the inside only deepened the confusion. Why destroy your own shelter unless escape was the only option? Then came the monsters. A newspaper hungry for sensation floated the idea of an unknown creature, a snow beast, a relic of folklore. Grainy photographs were reinterpreted. Shadows became shapes. Coincidences hardened into conviction. The lack of evidence became evidence itself. If nothing was found, it must have been hidden. Paranormal explanations multiplied. Ball lightning, infrasound, magnetic anomalies. Each theory solved one piece of the puzzle while ignoring the rest. None could explain everything. None could be fully disproven either, and that was the problem. In the absence of certainty, every idea felt equally plausible. Even the most mundane explanations struggled to gain traction. An avalanche, critics argued, would have left obvious signs. The tent wasn't buried. The slope wasn't steep enough. The footprints were still visible. If nature was responsible, why did it behave so strangely? As decades passed, the Dyatlov Pass Incident stopped being a single tragedy and became something else entirely, a canvas. Each generation painted its fears onto it. During the Cold War, it was secrecy and weapons. In the age of UFO fascination, it was visitors from the sky. Later, it became a story about government lies, about truth buried under bureaucracy. The hikers themselves slowly faded into the background. They became symbols rather than people, evidence rather than lives. Their names were repeated less often than the theories attached to them. The human cost was overshadowed by the hunger for mystery, but mystery thrives on gaps, and one by one, those gaps began to close. New technology emerged. Old files were reopened. Scientists started asking different questions, not about conspiracies, but about physics, terrain, and probability. They looked not for extraordinary explanations, but for ordinary ones that had been misunderstood. It took more than 60 years for that shift to matter. When the case was reopened in the late 2010s, expectations were low. Many assumed it would only produce another ambiguous statement, another bureaucratic dead end. Instead, it produced something far more unsettling, an answer that didn't rely on secrecy or monsters. An answer that suggested the hikers hadn't been hunted, silenced, or cursed. They had been overwhelmed, and the force that killed them didn't need to hide. It had been there the entire time. 350 words, somber clarity, existential unease. When the case was reopened, decades later, the goal was no longer to chase rumors. It was to test reality. Researchers returned to the mountain, not with theories, but with data. They studied the slope angle, the snow layers, the wind patterns. They reconstructed the night as it had actually been, not as legend had reshaped it. What they found was unsettling precisely because it was simple. The hikers had camped on a slope that appeared stable but wasn't. To create a flat platform, they had cut into the snowpack, unknowingly weakening it. Above them lay a dense slab of compacted snow, held in place by fragile layers beneath. Over the course of the night, wind piled additional weight onto that slab. Hours later, it failed, not with the roar of a massive avalanche, but with a sudden crushing release. A heavy block of snow slammed into the tent, collapsing part of it and injuring those inside. Ribs cracked, a skull fractured. The shelter became a trap. Faced with the threat of another collapse, they made the only decision that seemed possible. They cut their way out and retreated downhill toward the forest, choosing exposure over burial. Everything that followed grew from that moment. The fire under the cedar tree, the desperate climb for branches, the attempt to return uphill, the final shelter dug into the ravine, the injuries that once seemed impossible matched the physics of compacted snow pressing bodies against rock. The lack of external wounds made sense. The missing tongue and eyes were the work of time, water, and scavengers. The radiation traced back to prior work environments. The glowing lights in the sky came from unrelated military tests, distant and coincidental. Nothing supernatural was required. No conspiracy needed to be hidden. 9 people made rational decisions under impossible conditions, and nature responded without mercy. The horror of the Dyatlov Pass incident isn't that it defies explanation, it's that it doesn't. The truth offers no villain, no secret knowledge, no warning signs that feel dramatic in hindsight, just a series of small, understandable choices colliding with bad timing and indifferent physics. The mountain didn't trap them, it didn't hunt them, it simply moved, and that may be the hardest ending to accept. Would you like to make any refinements to the full script, or are we complete?